The 42nd floor of the Department of Justice building had been transformed into what federal investigators privately called the War Room. Attorney General Pam Bondi stood before a massive digital display showing financial networks that stretched across 6 continents, connecting seemingly legitimate businesses to one of the most sophisticated money laundering operations in criminal history. The red lines linking banks, investment firms, and shell companies created a web so complex that it had taken a team of forensic accountants 8 months to map even a portion of its scope. The War Room itself represented the largest financial investigation facility ever assembled by the federal government. 37 workstations equipped with specialized software for tracking financial transactions, cryptocurrency movements, and international wire transfers. Wall-mounted displays showed real-time data feeds from banks, regulatory agencies, and international financial intelligence units. The security protocols were so stringent that entry required biometric authentication and security clearances that had been enhanced specifically for this investigation. The investigation had consumed resources from across the federal government. Treasury Department analysts worked alongside FBI financial crimes specialists, DEA money laundering investigators, and even National Security Agency cryptographers who had been brought in to analyze encrypted communications between cartel financial operatives. The scope of the investigation had required coordination with financial intelligence units from 43 countries, making it the most international financial crimes investigation in American history. But what made the investigation truly unprecedented was its target. The Sinaloa Cartel's money laundering operation wasn't just large, it was sophisticated beyond anything previously encountered in criminal investigations. They had essentially reverse-engineered American financial systems, studying regulations, compliance procedures, and enforcement capabilities to create laundering networks that exploited every weakness in the system while avoiding detection by traditional investigative methods. "What you're seeing," Bondi announced to the assembled task force of FBI financial crimes specialists, Treasury Department investigators, and Securities and Exchange Commission enforcement attorneys, represents the financial backbone of the Sinaloa Cartel's North American operations. They're not just washing drug money. They've essentially created a parallel banking system that processes over $2 billion annually. The assembled task force represented the most experienced financial investigators in federal law enforcement. FBI Financial Crimes Division Director Sarah Martinez had spent 15 years investigating everything from mortgage fraud to terrorist financing. Treasury Department Deputy Director Michael Torres had led investigations into offshore tax evasion schemes that had recovered billions in hidden assets. Securities and Exchange Commission Enforcement Director Jennifer Walsh had prosecuted some of the largest securities fraud cases in American history. Yet each of these seasoned investigators had been shocked by the scope and sophistication of what they had discovered. The Sinaloa Cartel's financial operation wasn't just a money laundering scheme, it was a comprehensive alternative financial system that competed directly with legitimate banking and investment networks. The investigation, codenamed Operation Clean Sweep, had begun 18 months earlier, when Treasury Department analysts noticed unusual patterns in currency transaction reports filed by banks in major American cities. Large cash deposits were being made in amounts just below the $10,000 threshold that triggered automatic federal reporting requirements. But the sophisticated part wasn't the individual deposits. It was the coordination across hundreds of accounts that suggested systematic structuring designed to avoid detection. The initial detection had come from the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, known as FinCEN, which processes over 20 million financial reports annually looking for patterns that might indicate money laundering or terrorist financing. Senior analyst Dr. Patricia Williams had been reviewing quarterly reports when she noticed statistical anomalies in cash deposit patterns across multiple cities. The anomalies were subtle but significant. In cities with known drug trafficking problems, the number of cash deposits just below reporting thresholds had increased by over 300% in 18 months. More concerning was the geographic correlation. Cities showing similar deposit patterns were connected by major interstate highways that intelligence suggested were primary drug trafficking routes. Dr. Williams had spent her career analyzing financial data for signs of criminal activity. She had developed mathematical models that could identify money laundering patterns in massive data sets, techniques that had been adopted by financial intelligence units around the world. But the patterns she was seeing in the Sinaloa investigation were unlike anything in her experience. They suggested coordination and planning on a scale that challenged assumptions about criminal financial capabilities. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Marcus Chen, a senior analyst at Goldman Sachs who had been reviewing unusual trading patterns in cryptocurrency markets, had noticed that certain digital currency transactions corresponded almost perfectly with traditional money laundering indicators his compliance training had taught him to recognize. Chen's decision to report his suspicions to federal authorities had opened a window into financial networks that dwarfed anything previously discovered in cartel investigations. Chen had been working on Goldman Sachs's cryptocurrency trading desk for 3 years, analyzing market patterns and identifying arbitrage opportunities in digital currency markets. His background included advanced degrees in mathematics and computer science, along with specialized training in financial crime detection that all major investment firms provided to their employees. The patterns that had caught Chen's attention were subtle but persistent. Large cryptocurrency purchases were being made through multiple exchanges, at times that correlated with traditional banking hours in cities known for drug trafficking activity. The purchases used different digital wallets and payment methods, but the timing and amounts suggested coordination that was unlikely to occur through normal market activity. More concerning was the geographic distribution of the cryptocurrency transactions. The digital wallet addresses could be traced to IP addresses in cities along major drug trafficking routes, and the timing of transactions suggested they were being used to move value across borders in ways that traditional banking systems would have detected and reported. Chen's compliance training had taught him that money laundering operations often involved multiple payment systems to complicate detection and investigation. The combination of traditional banking deposits and cryptocurrency transactions suggested a sophisticated operation that was using emerging financial technologies to exploit gaps in regulatory oversight. His decision to report the suspicious activity had required considerable personal courage. Goldman Sachs maintained strict confidentiality policies regarding client information, and Chen risked his career by providing details about trading patterns to federal investigators. But his compliance training had emphasized that financial institutions had legal obligations to report suspicious activity, and Chen believed that the patterns he had identified clearly met the criteria for mandatory reporting. The information provided by Chen had allowed federal investigators to connect traditional money laundering indicators with emerging cryptocurrency-based laundering techniques. This connection had revealed the true scope of the Sinaloa Cartel's financial operation and provided the foundation for an investigation that would ultimately span 6 continents and involve 43 countries. FBI Financial Crimes Division Director Sarah Martinez stepped forward to present the scope of what investigators had uncovered. Martinez had spent 15 years investigating financial crimes, from mortgage fraud during the 2008 financial crisis to terrorist financing networks that had funded attacks around the world. But the Sinaloa Cartel's money laundering operation represented a level of sophistication that challenged every assumption about criminal financial capabilities. Martinez's career had been built on understanding how criminal organizations adapted to law enforcement pressure. She had watched drug trafficking organizations evolve from simple cash-based operations to sophisticated financial networks that rivaled legitimate multinational corporations. She had investigated money laundering schemes that involved everything from real estate manipulation to trade-based laundering through import-export businesses. But the Sinaloa investigation had revealed something entirely new. The cartel hadn't just adapted to existing financial systems, they had essentially created their own parallel financial infrastructure that operated within legitimate systems while remaining largely invisible to traditional detection methods. The cartel has essentially weaponized American financial systems against law enforcement, Martinez began, clicking through slides that showed the progression of dirty money from street-level drug sales to legitimate investment portfolios. They've studied our banking regulations, our compliance procedures, and our enforcement capabilities, then designed systems specifically to exploit weaknesses in our financial monitoring infrastructure. The slides revealed the sophistication of the cartel's analytical capabilities. Intelligence gathered from seized computers had shown that cartel financial operatives had studied federal banking regulations in detail, identifying specific provisions that could be exploited for money laundering purposes. They had analyzed enforcement statistics to understand which types of financial activity were most likely to trigger investigations and which were most likely to avoid detection. Most disturbing was evidence that the cartel had recruited legitimate financial professionals to advise their money laundering operations. Former bank compliance officers, retired regulatory officials, and even academics who specialized in financial crime detection had been identified as consultants to the cartel's financial operations. These consultants had provided the cartel with inside knowledge of how financial institutions detected and reported suspicious activity. They had helped design money laundering techniques that specifically exploited weaknesses in compliance systems used by major banks. Some had even provided training to cartel operatives on how to conduct financial transactions in ways that would avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements. The money laundering network operated through 5 distinct phases, each designed to further distance criminal proceeds from their illegal origins. Phase 1 involved collecting cash from drug sales in cities across the United States and converting it into money orders, cashier's checks, and prepaid debit cards through networks of recruiters who were often unaware of the criminal nature of their activities. The cash collection network was vast and sophisticated. Street-level drug dealers in over 30 American cities were required to deliver cash proceeds to collection points managed by cartel financial operatives. The collection points were typically located in legitimate businesses, restaurants, auto repair shops, beauty salons, that provided cover for large cash transactions. At each collection point, cash was counted, verified, and converted into financial instruments that were easier to transport and deposit into banking systems. Money orders were purchased from multiple sources to avoid pattern detection. Cashier's checks were obtained from different banks using straw purchasers with legitimate identification. Prepaid debit cards were loaded with cash and then used for online transactions that further obscured the money trail. Phase 2 was the structuring phase, where converted funds were deposited into hundreds of bank accounts opened using stolen identities, shell companies, and straw purchasers. The accounts were distributed across multiple banks in different states, making it virtually impossible for any single financial institution to detect the coordinated nature of the deposits. Sophisticated software was used to vary deposit amounts, timing, and geographic distribution to avoid triggering pattern recognition systems used by federal investigators. The account opening process was methodical and systematic. The cartel had recruited networks of individuals with clean criminal records and good credit histories to open accounts using their legitimate identities. These straw account holders were typically offered several $1,000s for their participation, often believing they were helping with legitimate business operations rather than money laundering schemes. The cartel had also established dozens of shell companies with legitimate business registrations, tax identification numbers, and even basic business operations that provided justification for regular cash deposits. These companies operated in cash-intensive industries, restaurants, retail stores, service businesses, where large cash deposits would appear normal to bank compliance officers. Most sophisticated was the software system that managed deposit timing and amounts. Federal investigators had discovered that the cartel was using custom-developed algorithms that analyzed federal enforcement patterns and bank compliance procedures to optimize deposit schedules. The software could process information about bank holiday schedules, compliance officer shift changes, and even seasonal variations in banking activity to time deposits when they were least likely to trigger suspicion. Phase 3 involved the integration of criminal proceeds into legitimate business operations. The cartel had purchased or established control over dozens of companies across multiple industries, restaurants, construction firms, import-export businesses, and even technology startups. These companies generated legitimate revenue that was commingled with criminal proceeds, making it extremely difficult to distinguish between legal and illegal income streams. The business acquisition strategy was particularly sophisticated. Rather than purchasing existing businesses outright, which might trigger scrutiny from regulators or law enforcement, the cartel often became silent partners in legitimate operations. They would provide capital investment or operating loans to struggling businesses, gradually increasing their control while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business ownership. The businesses chosen for integration were carefully selected based on their suitability for money laundering operations. Cash-intensive businesses like restaurants and retail stores provided natural cover for large cash deposits. Construction companies could justify substantial equipment purchases and subcontractor payments that could be used to move money through the economy. Import-export businesses provided opportunities for trade-based money laundering that exploited gaps in international financial monitoring. But Phase 4 was where the operation became truly sophisticated. Clean money from legitimate business operations was invested in real estate, stocks, bonds, and even emerging financial instruments like cryptocurrency and foreign exchange markets. The cartel had essentially created their own investment management operation, complete with financial advisors who may or may not have known the true source of the funds they were managing. The investment strategy demonstrated remarkable financial sophistication. Portfolio managers working for cartel front companies had developed diversified investment strategies that included domestic and international stocks, government and corporate bonds, real estate investment trusts, and even alternative investments like precious metals and art collections. The investment portfolios were managed using the same techniques employed by legitimate institutional investors. Risk management strategies included diversification across asset classes and geographic regions. Performance monitoring systems tracked returns and adjusted allocation strategies based on market conditions. The investment operation even employed analysts who prepared regular reports on portfolio performance and market outlook. Phase 5 was the repatriation phase, where laundered money was returned to cartel leadership in Mexico through a combination of traditional methods and innovative techniques that exploited gaps in international financial monitoring. Trade-based money laundering allowed the cartel to over-invoice or under-invoice legitimate international transactions, moving money across borders while appearing to conduct normal commercial activities. The repatriation techniques were the most complex component of the entire operation. Traditional methods included bulk cash smuggling using the same networks employed for drug trafficking, but in reverse. Sophisticated methods involved manipulation of international trade transactions that moved value across borders without triggering traditional financial monitoring systems. The cartel had established import-export companies on both sides of the border that conducted legitimate trade in products ranging from agricultural goods to manufactured items. These companies would over-invoice exports from Mexico to the United States, allowing Mexican cartel operatives to receive legitimate payments that exceeded the actual value of goods shipped. Conversely, they would under-invoice imports from the United States to Mexico, allowing American cartel operatives to provide goods at below-market prices while receiving the difference through alternative channels. Even more sophisticated was the manipulation of currency exchange markets. The cartel had established relationships with currency exchange businesses in multiple countries that provided services for converting dollars to pesos at rates that included hidden fees for money laundering services. These businesses appeared to be conducting legitimate currency exchange operations while actually facilitating the movement of criminal proceeds across international borders. The scope of the repatriation operation was staggering. Intelligence estimates suggested that the cartel was moving over $500 million annually from the United States back to Mexico through various repatriation techniques. This represented a significant portion of the cartel's total revenue and funded everything from continued drug trafficking operations to corruption of Mexican government officials to expansion into new criminal enterprises. The total operation processes approximately $2 billion annually, Martinez continued, which means the Sinaloa Cartel is moving more money through American financial systems than many Fortune 500 companies generate in annual revenue. The scale comparison was not hyperbolic. $2 billion in annual money laundering volume placed the Sinaloa Cartel's financial operation among the largest in the world. By comparison, many publicly traded companies with thousands of employees and international operations generated less annual revenue than the cartel was processing through its money laundering networks. The financial sophistication required to process this volume of money was remarkable. The cartel's financial operation employed over 300 people, from street-level cash collectors to sophisticated financial analysts with advanced degrees from prestigious universities. The operation included specialists in banking regulations, cryptocurrency markets, international trade finance, and investment management. Most disturbing was the professionalization of the cartel's financial operations. Rather than relying on criminal associates with limited financial expertise, the cartel had recruited legitimate financial professionals who brought skills and knowledge that had been developed in legitimate financial institutions. These professionals had essentially applied their training and experience to create criminal financial networks that were more sophisticated than many legitimate businesses. Treasury Department Deputy Director Michael Torres presented the Wall Street connections that had shocked federal investigators. The cartel's money laundering network had successfully penetrated major American financial institutions, not through corruption or coercion, but by exploiting the normal operations of legitimate businesses to clean criminal proceeds. Torres had spent 20 years investigating financial crimes for the Treasury Department, including offshore tax evasion schemes, terrorist financing networks, and sanctions violations by foreign governments. But the Sinaloa Cartel investigation had revealed that criminal organizations could achieve the same money laundering objectives through patient manipulation of legitimate financial systems rather than dramatic criminal conspiracies. His investigation had uncovered a disturbing reality about modern financial systems. The volume and complexity of legitimate financial transactions had grown so large that even sophisticated compliance systems struggled to identify criminal activity that was deliberately designed to mimic normal business operations. The cartel had essentially weaponized the legitimate financial system's own size and complexity against law enforcement detection efforts. "We've identified cartel money flowing through accounts at 12 major American banks," Torres announced, revealing information that would send shockwaves through financial markets if it became public. Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citibank, these institutions have unknowingly processed hundreds of millions in cartel proceeds through their normal commercial operations. The list of affected financial institutions read like a directory of American banking. J.P. Morgan Chase, the largest bank in the United States, had processed over $200 million in cartel-related transactions through accounts that appeared to be legitimate business operations. Bank of America had handled similar volumes through investment accounts and commercial lending relationships. Wells Fargo had been used for real estate transactions that involved properties purchased with laundered drug proceeds. The banks themselves were not accused of criminal activity. The cartel's money laundering operation had been specifically designed to exploit legitimate banking services while avoiding detection by compliance systems that had been developed to prevent exactly this type of criminal activity. The sophistication lay not in corrupting financial institutions but in understanding their operations well enough to abuse their services without triggering automatic reporting requirements. The compliance systems used by major banks were impressive in their scope and sophistication. They processed millions of transactions daily, looking for patterns that might indicate money laundering, terrorist financing, or other criminal activity. These systems incorporated artificial intelligence, machine learning, and advanced statistical analysis to identify suspicious patterns in massive data sets. But the cartel's money laundering operation had been designed by individuals who understood these compliance systems intimately. Former bank employees who had worked in compliance departments provided insights into how detection algorithms functioned and how they could be defeated. Retired regulatory officials who had helped design anti-money laundering regulations advised the cartel on how to structure transactions to avoid triggering reporting requirements. More disturbing were the connections to investment firms and securities markets. Federal investigators had traced cartel money through investment accounts at major brokerage firms where criminal proceeds had been used to purchase stocks, bonds, and other securities. The investments had been managed by legitimate financial advisors who had no knowledge that their clients' assets had originated from drug trafficking operations. The investment firm connections were particularly troubling because they involved some of the most prestigious names in American finance. Merrill Lynch had managed investment portfolios containing cartel money through accounts that appeared to belong to legitimate high-net-worth individuals. Morgan Stanley had provided wealth management services for accounts funded with laundered drug proceeds. Even Goldman Sachs, despite Marcus Chen's efforts to report suspicious activity, had been used for sophisticated investment transactions involving cartel assets. The financial advisors managing these accounts were typically legitimate professionals with excellent reputations and extensive experience managing wealth for high-net-worth clients. They had no reason to suspect that their clients' assets had criminal origins, particularly since the money had been successfully laundered before reaching investment markets. The investment strategies employed were sophisticated and diversified, indistinguishable from legitimate wealth management activities. Portfolios included blue-chip stocks, government bonds, international investments, and alternative assets like real estate investment trusts and commodity funds. The investment performance was regularly monitored, and portfolio allocations were adjusted based on market conditions and risk management considerations. We've identified over $300 million in cartel assets currently invested in American securities markets, Torres continued. This includes holdings in blue-chip stocks, government bonds, and even mutual funds marketed to retirement investors. The cartel has essentially become an institutional investor in American financial markets. The revelation had staggering implications for financial markets and regulatory policy. If criminal organizations could successfully infiltrate legitimate investment markets, the integrity of American financial systems was fundamentally compromised. More immediately, federal authorities faced the challenge of identifying and seizing criminal assets that had been deliberately integrated with legitimate investments to make detection and recovery extremely difficult. Bondi studied the financial flowcharts that covered the walls of the war room. Each red line represented millions of dollars in criminal proceeds that had been successfully laundered through American financial institutions. The scope was breathtaking. The Sinaloa Cartel had essentially created a shadow financial system that operated within legitimate American banking and investment networks. "This isn't just money laundering," Bondi observed, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the broader implications of what they had discovered. "This is financial warfare. The cartels are using our own financial systems to undermine the rule of law, corrupt legitimate commerce, and fund continuing criminal operations." The strategic implications extended far beyond law enforcement. If criminal organizations could successfully exploit American financial systems at this scale, similar techniques could be employed by terrorist organizations, foreign intelligence services, and other adversaries seeking to move money through the United States while avoiding detection. Securities and Exchange Commission Director Jennifer Walsh presented the regulatory challenges posed by the cartel's sophisticated financial operations. Walsh had spent her career investigating securities fraud, insider trading, and market manipulation, but the Sinaloa Cartel case represented a new category of financial crime that existing regulations were poorly equipped to address. "The problem is that the cartel's money laundering operation doesn't violate securities laws," Walsh explained. "They're not manipulating stock prices, engaging in insider trading, or defrauding investors. They're simply using investment markets to store and transfer value, which is exactly what those markets are designed to do." The regulatory gap was profound. Financial regulations had been developed to prevent fraud and market manipulation, not to identify the original source of investment capital. As long as the cartel's money had been successfully laundered before entering investment markets, their securities transactions appeared completely legitimate to regulatory monitoring systems. This created a paradox for federal law enforcement. The more successful the cartel's money laundering operation became, the more difficult it was to distinguish their activities from legitimate financial transactions. By the time criminal proceeds reached investment markets, they had been so thoroughly integrated with legitimate funds that standard investigative techniques were largely ineffective. DEA Financial Intelligence Unit Director Robert Martinez presented the international dimensions of the money laundering network. The Sinaloa Cartel's financial operations extended far beyond the United States, involving banks and financial institutions in over 30 countries. The international scope made investigation and prosecution exponentially more complex, requiring coordination with foreign law enforcement agencies that might have different legal standards and enforcement priorities. "We've traced cartel money through banks in Switzerland, Singapore, Panama, and the Cayman Islands," Martinez reported. "But we've also found significant operations in countries where we have limited law enforcement cooperation: Venezuela, Iran, and North Korea." The cartel is essentially exploiting international financial networks, the same way they've exploited domestic systems. The international connections revealed the global nature of modern money laundering operations. The Sinaloa Cartel had formed partnerships with criminal organizations around the world, sharing techniques, resources, and financial infrastructure in ways that made traditional law enforcement approaches largely obsolete. Perhaps most disturbing was evidence that the cartel had formed relationships with state-sponsored actors who provided financial services in exchange for access to drug trafficking networks. These relationships created national security implications that extended far beyond traditional law enforcement concerns. Bondi had been briefed on intelligence suggesting that Iranian financial institutions were providing money laundering services to Mexican cartels in exchange for access to North American drug distribution networks. The arrangement allowed Iran to move money through American financial systems while avoiding sanctions, while providing cartels with sophisticated financial services that would have been impossible to develop independently. Similar relationships had been identified with Russian oligarchs who used cartel money laundering networks to move assets through American financial systems while avoiding sanctions related to the Ukraine conflict. Chinese criminal organizations provided cryptocurrency conversion services that allowed cartels to move money through digital currency markets without triggering traditional banking compliance requirements. "We're not just investigating a money laundering operation," Bondi told the assembled task force. "We're confronting a fundamental challenge to American financial sovereignty. Foreign adversaries are using criminal organizations to penetrate and exploit our financial systems in ways that threaten both law enforcement and national security. The response strategy would require unprecedented coordination between law enforcement agencies, financial regulators, and intelligence services. Operation Clean Sweep would involve simultaneous actions across multiple jurisdictions, targeting not just the criminal proceeds themselves, but the infrastructure that made large-scale money laundering possible. Phase 1 would involve coordinated raids on businesses identified as money laundering fronts, with particular focus on operations in Los Angeles, Miami, Chicago, and New York. FBI teams would execute search warrants, while Treasury investigators froze associated bank accounts and investment portfolios. Phase 2 would target the human networks that managed the money laundering operation. Over 200 individuals had been identified as participants in various aspects of the scheme, from street-level money couriers to sophisticated financial advisors who managed investment portfolios. Arrests would be coordinated to prevent participants from destroying evidence or fleeing to avoid prosecution. Phase 3 would involve civil asset forfeiture actions against properties, investments, and other assets purchased with criminal proceeds. The scope was enormous. Federal authorities had identified over $500 million in assets that could be subject to forfeiture, including commercial real estate, luxury vehicles, art collections, and investment portfolios. But Phase 4 would be the most complex, working with international partners to dismantle the global infrastructure that supported the money laundering network. This would require diplomatic negotiations, mutual legal assistance treaties, and coordination with foreign law enforcement agencies that might have competing priorities and different legal frameworks. The Sinaloa Cartel believes they've created a money laundering system that's too big and too complex for American law enforcement to dismantle, Bondi announced to the task force. They've calculated that our agencies don't have the resources, coordination, or political will to take on a financial operation of this magnitude. She paused, studying the faces of the investigators who had spent months mapping the cartel's financial networks. They're about to discover that calculation was a fatal mistake. Operation Clean Sweep will demonstrate that no criminal organization, regardless of its sophistication or resources, is beyond the reach of American justice. The briefing concluded with operational assignments that would mobilize hundreds of federal agents and investigators across multiple agencies. The money laundering network that had taken years to construct would be dismantled in a coordinated assault that would span continents and involve the largest financial crime investigation in American history. As the task force members departed to begin final preparations for Operation Clean Sweep, Bondi remained in the war room, studying the financial networks that covered the walls. Somewhere within those red lines connecting banks, businesses, and investment firms was the key to crippling the Sinaloa Cartel's financial operations and demonstrating that American financial systems could not be weaponized against American law enforcement. The cartels had made their greatest mistake by believing that complexity could defeat determination. They were about to learn that Pam Bondi's Justice Department was prepared to follow criminal money wherever it led, regardless of how sophisticated the schemes designed to hide it. Within 72 hours, Operation Clean Sweep would begin, and the financial networks that had funded cartel operations across North America would become the foundation for the largest asset forfeiture operation in federal law enforcement history.